Right, good morning again. Okay, so what I'm going to do today is to start off really as an introductory talk for the rest of the talks you're going to have today, which are explaining in detail the concept and the components of the 20 planes approach to the second trimester scan. And as Reem said, this is something that we've developed really for the basic training program. A lot of you who scan already or are being taught already may well be using a sort of template, which is very similar to this, obviously, but this is we've designed this really just for the basic training program. So at the end of the presentation, hopefully, you'll be able to explain how to perform a structured routine examination. We're not talking about referral examinations, we're talking about routine examinations, including measurements of the mid-trimester fetus, the 20-week fetus, using the 2 overview and 20 planes approach that we're going to discuss today. So the key questions that hopefully you'll be able to answer by the end of the presentation is what is the rationale between the 2 overview and 20 planes? It's a bit of a mouthful, so we've broken it down or abbreviated to 2 plus 20 approach, and as the Congress continues, hopefully you'll hear lots of people whispering about, have you heard about the 2 plus 20 approach? It's very exciting. But that's what we're talking about, the 2 plus 20. You hopefully will be able to understand what the 2 plus 20 planes are, and importantly, how the planes we're going to discuss and what you're going to learn about relate to the ISUOG basic training recommendations and also the other ISUOG guidelines which have already been published, which hopefully you're familiar with from the web. And at the end of the process, really by knowing what the normal planes look like, you'll be able to have some idea of which abnormalities you should be able to exclude, not necessarily to confirm the diagnosis of, but you should be able to exclude when the 2 plus 20 planes approach is performed correctly, because that really is the whole process, the whole concept of what you're trying to do when you're examining the 20-week fetus in a routine examination. So the rationale behind the 2 plus 20 or the 20 plus 2 approach is to provide a structured and a logical method of examining the mid-trimester fetus. You need to have a mental tick list in your brain, which you will go through, hopefully, in a structured way. You may not be able to do it in completely that order, but you need to have a template and a checklist in your brain with which you approach every 20-week scan, and this is what we're going to talk about today. So what you're going to do within this approach is you're going to be able to assess the fetal size by measuring the biparietal diameter, the head circumference, the abdominal circumference, and the femur length. Those are the 4 principal measurements that you will learn to do, and hopefully you may well be able to do already. So the biometry is important as a component of the approach, and as well as the measurements, obviously the anatomical review that has the potential, if performed correctly, to exclude 50 fetal abnormal appearances. Not necessarily abnormalities, because not all the abnormal appearances will be abnormalities, but it's abnormal appearances, and distinguish between abnormal appearances and normal appearances, which is the key to your successful examination. So let's get down to basics. The 2 plus 20 planes, what are they? They're a combination of 2 overview sweeps and 20 planes, which we've divided for ease into 7 anatomical areas of the fetus. And if you look in your pack, you will have a sheet that looks like this somewhere, which gives you a spreadsheet of the 20 planes divided into the 7 anatomical areas, and on the back you will see the 50 abnormalities listed that we will be discussing and will be a component of the examination. So this is really what we're going to talk about today, and the bread and butter of the whole thing. So the 22 plus 20 are a combination of 2 overview sweeps, one at the beginning and one at the end, and 20 planes of the fetus. Each plane relates to a specific fetal section or view and addresses the measurements that are to be included in that particular plane. There are a number of things, structures within each plane that have to be evaluated, and those are based and taken from the ISUOG reference documents, which we will discuss in just a moment. So all the concepts and the components of the approach are based on the published ISUOG guidelines. Also included are the criteria which you should adopt for referral if you find a structure that's abnormal or a measurement that's abnormal. That is addressed in the approach. And the combination of the 2 plus 20 planes, as I've said before, will enable the potential, if it's done correctly, exclusion of the 50 abnormal fetal appearances, which are listed on the back of that sheet of paper. Now, some of those will depend a little bit on local practice. Not every department will assess as much of the fetus as other departments, but what we have addressed here is a combination of what is included in the ISUOG guidelines and also what the Basic Training Committee feel should be component parts of a routine approach. So there's a little combination of both. So the reference documents that we're going to use and which relate to the planes that we're going to discuss are 4, and they're listed at the bottom if you actually want the references. The first one is the ISUOG Education Committee recommendations for basic training, and that really is what underpins the whole of this programme, and you've got a copy of that in your pack. And that first came out online in 2013, and that's now actually published in 2014 in the White Journal. Then the second one is the practice guidelines for performance of the routine mid-trimester fetal ultrasound scan, so the 20-week scan. And that was came out before that. That was 2010. And the oldest one is addressing the basic examination of the fetal central nervous system, the basic examination and the more advanced fetal neurosonogram, and that's 2007, as I said before. And then the latest one is the second version of the cardiac screening guidelines, which came out in 2013. So those are the 4 documents that really should form the bedrock of your examination. So the 2+20 planes, as you can see, are listed here, and the individual speakers, as you can see from the programme, are going to go through these planes and anatomical areas as we go through the day. So I don't need to read those out. These are the first 10, and then the second 10 here. So there's a sweep at the front and a sweep at the beginning, because you've got to find the baby before you start examining it, and then there's a sweep at the end, which puts the whole thing together when you've finished your examination, and then the 20 different planes in between. So the sections that are required, and these are images and diagrams taken from the guidelines. So those of you that are familiar with the 4 sets of guidelines will be familiar with these diagrams. So these are the 3 planes of the head that are described in the mid-trimester guideline, and these comprise, this is plane 4, this is plane 5, this is plane 6. So this is the ventricular section here, this is the thalamic section here, and this is the cerebellar section here, and these will be discussed later on by Suresh. And then we have how to measure the ventricle. Again, this is from the same reference guideline, inner to inner across the widest part of the ventricle, as listed in BMUS, in the ISUOG guideline. There are several images and diagrams of the heart. I haven't included them all here for space, but these obviously come from the cardiac guideline. The measurements that are included now, ISUOG requires measurement of the biparietal diameter, not for the ventricular plane, which some of you may use in your departments. We use in the UK, we use this particular plane for measuring the head circumference and the biparietal diameter. But the ISUOG recommendation is that the transthalamic plane is the section that is used for measurement of the head circumference and the BPD. You use the ventricular plane for measuring the ventricle. The abdominal circumference is fairly standard internationally. I think everybody measures in the same place and measures it in the same way. And the femur length, again, is a fairly standard measurement. It depends a little bit on whether you have the femur horizontal to the probe or at a slight angle, but these are the measurements that ISUOG recommend, I beg your pardon. The anatomy, again, is addressed in the routine examination. The cord insertion we can see here. This is lower down. This is the bladder here. And these are the kidneys. It's always a good idea to measure a fetus that comes fully labelled. This is the spine at the top, and these are the kidneys here. And this is the longitudinal section of the spine from that guideline. The arms and the legs, there is no requirement to count the fingers and toes, but certainly you should be able to measure the femur and look at the tib and fib on both legs and assess the carrying angle of both feet, and the same with the arms, the humerus, radius and ulnar, and the presence of the hand and the carrying angle of the hand off the lower arm. And then finally, the face, the upper lip, the profile, the median profile, and the orbits and lenses. So those are the sort of sections and the sort of standard of view that you should be attaining when you're doing your sections. So this brings us to the abnormalities that can be excluded. And what's important and what we really want to stress from today is this isn't about you, when you're starting off in your scanning careers, it's not about making a diagnosis. You refer to somebody else who will make the diagnosis. The key to what you're doing, and the most important thing that you are doing, is knowing what the normal range of appearances are and determining whether the appearances that you have are within that range of normal appearances or are not normal. So the key is understanding the importance of knowing what's normal in each plane, and this therefore then equates to the exclusion of the range of abnormal appearances or abnormalities, rather than making a diagnosis, and that's really important. So the key to the whole thing, that you are the most important people because you're the people that pick up the problem in the first place. The people that get referred, have the fetus referred, it's easy because they know there's a problem. The skill is in the sort of thing that you're doing with the routine examination. The range of abnormal appearances, as we've touched on briefly, depend a little bit on the local service requirements, because some departments and some programs will look at a different range of abnormalities, chromosomal abnormalities particularly, and may manage those pregnancies differently. So therefore there will be a slight difference in the tick list, if you will, within different regions, departments, countries. So the requirements from each plane, as you can see from your table in your pack, we have the description of the particular plane, and then the structures that should be evaluated when assessing that plane here. The list for the transventricular plane, for example, is quite long, and this again is quoted from the guidelines, so it's not something we've invented. This is all from the ISUOG recommendations. And some planes will have measurements. So here, for example, in the transventricular plane, you are required to measure the posterior horn. And if the most posterior horn measured correctly is greater than 10.0 millimeters, then that patient needs to be referred, etc. So that's all very well, and that's all marvellous, and we've now got our tick list in our heads. How are we actually going to go about it? So what we're going to do to start with is we've got to find how the baby or the fetus is lying in the uterus, because what we want to do in our first sweep, before we start doing our cross-sectional planes, is actually look at the longitudinal lie of the fetus for initial orientation, and to see whether the baby's alive to start with. So that's all very well, but we've actually got to find where the baby's lying in the uterus to start with. So how do we approaching sweep one? So the baby can be in all sorts of positions. It can be transverse, it can be head down, back on the maternal left, back on the maternal right. It can be breech, or if you're really unlucky, it can be moving really fast so you can't see it till it stops. So what we're going to do in approaching sweep one is we use something which ISUOG is very keen to promote, and certainly it is a firm part of day one of our basic training program. Is use Alfred Abdelhamed's standardized 6-step approach to performing a basic focused obstetric examination. And this basically describes, very simply, there's a reference there, how to actually find where the presentation of the lie of the fetus. And it really revolves around where you start, where you place your probe in the beginning, whether you start with longitudinal survey of the uterus, or whether you start with the transverse survey of the uterus. And what we're interested in, particularly in today's presentations, is how to determine the fetal lie and the presentation using the 6 steps approach. And so as you can see from here, and you can look at Alfred's presentation from day one of the program online if you want to. You start off to find where your fetus is lying by starting with the transverse section of the uterus, and you're going to survey your uterus using transverse sections, and that's what the 6-step approach is about. So here you can see just starting off, angling the probe to find out what we've got at the bottom of the uterus to see whether or not there's a bottom there or a head there. And then there are various other planes that are assessed. But the start off is transverse probe at the bottom of the uterus. So we found out by using the 6 steps approach where the baby is lying in the uterus, and then what we're going to do is do the first overview, because we're going to look at planes 1, 2, and 3, which Titsi will talk about in a minute. Okay, so we've decided in this particular fetus, this is where the orientation of the baby, and that's the first plane. We're going to have a longitudinal picture of the fetus by placing the probe in this plane here, which will give us a sagittal or a coronal section of the spine with a skin covering, which is what we're aiming for. In this particular plane, we will get a sagittal view, and if we're going to go from planes 1 to 2, what we need to do is we need to angle our probe through 90 degrees, because we want to go from a sagittal plane to a coronal plane. So you need to be very clear about what you're doing, about what your probe does, and the 4 movements that you can do with your probe to be able to do this, to be able to go through this approach properly. So to go from a sagittal plane to a coronal plane, you need to angle your probe through 90 degrees to approach the fetus from the coronal plane, not the sagittal plane. And then if you want to get a coronal section of the body, then what you're going to do is you're going to slide from plane 2 to plane 3 to go from the spine to the coronal section of the body. So to achieve planes 4, 5, and 6, we now know where the baby's lying, and we can achieve either a coronal or a sagittal section of the baby's spine. What we're going to do, because we're going to look at the head in cross-section, is we're going to move our probe through 90 degrees, rotate our probe through 90 degrees to achieve plane 4 in the baby's head. Plane 4 to plane 5 is a sliding movement. Plane 4 to plane 6, which is the ventricular view to the cerebellar view, the front of the head stays the same, and the back of the head, you rotate the probe to image the back of the head, the cerebellum, so that's a rotational movement. And these are the things that you need to learn and get into your head as you move through the 20 planes. So to go from looking at planes 7, 8, 9 and 10, which are the chest planes, we're going to start off again with our sagittal section of the fetus. It might be coronal, it might be sagittal, longitudinal section of the fetus. Then we're going to look at the chest in cross-section. So what we're going to do is we're going to rotate from that first or second plane through 90 degrees to get a cross-section of the baby's chest. We're then going to go from the four-chamber view of the heart up to the left ventricular section, which requires a slight rotation towards the right shoulder. Then to get to plane 9, the easiest way is to go back to plane the four-chamber view, and slide up rather than rotate. Just slide up to the RVOT, and then again slide up to the three-vessel trachea view. Having got to the three-vessel trachea view, we're now going to go back down into the abdomen to look at the abdominal circumference, etc. Now, you may choose to do these in a different order, but for the purposes of the approach, this is the order that we've suggested. So you're up in the chest, and what you're going to do then is simply slide down from the chest down to the abdominal circumference section. You're then going to slide down to the transverse section of the abdomen because you want to look at the cord insertion. You're then going to look at the kidneys. Now, this requires the kidneys, because the kidneys aren't usually quite in the same plane as the abdominal circumference section or the cord insertion. You may need to rotate a little bit because you're going to look at the kidneys in cross-section, and you need to look at both kidneys properly in cross-section. So you may need to rotate the probe to get the ideal view of the kidney in cross-section on each side. And then you're going to go back from your transverse section to slide down to look at the fetal bladder and the umbilical arteries coursing round the bladder to check that there's a three-vessel cord. And then we're going to go and measure the thigh bone. So we're going to start with our abdominal circumference section. Now, this is something that's a little bit random, really, because babies don't all tend to have their legs in the same position, as you would have realised. So the suggestion is you start from your abdominal circumference section and you slide down to the bottom end of the baby. Slide, don't just take your probe off, otherwise you'll end up looking at the baby's arms, not the legs. And you find some part of what you hope is the femur in that image, and then you rotate your probe to get the full length of the femur. And then what you're also then trying to do is to include an image of the tibia and fibula. And so what you need to do there is, again, it's difficult to give you a concise instruction because it depends obviously on where the baby's legs or lower leg is relative to the femur. But usually it's a combination of rotating, possibly with a little bit of angling to image the tib and fib, and again to include the foot as well and the carrying angle of the foot, because what you want is a sagittal section, if you will, of the leg seen from the side to get that view that you saw originally. And you're going to do exactly the same thing with the arms. Start with the abdominal circumference section and then just slide up to image an arm. And again, slide up, don't take your probe off and put it back on again, because you'll invariably end up at the bottom end of the fetus and you'll end up remeasuring a femur. Slide from your abdominal circumference up to the shoulder, and then find something outside the baby's chest which looks like a humerus. Rotate on that to get the humerus, and then slide and rotate to image the radius and ulna and the hand. And then finally looking at planes 18 to 20, which are the baby's face. What we're going to do is we're going to start with plane 4, which, if you remember, was the ventricular plane up in the head. And to get to the upper lip and the nose and the nostrils, what you would need to do is you need to slide down to about the orbits and then rotate through 45 to 70 degrees. So you're coming down, your probe is up here at the ventricular level, you're going to slide down to about the orbits, and then you're going to rotate through 45 to 70 degrees. It depends a little bit on how the baby's lying. And then usually you're going to have to slide forwards a little bit just to get right to the front of the face. So there we are. And then for the orbits and the lenses, what you're going to do is you start from your ventricular level and you slide down, and you'll probably you need to rotate minimally to get the correct view of the orbits and the lenses. And you'll notice from this section that you will be in occipito-transverse position, because that's this position or the plane that you want the baby's head circumference to be in. And the image that you want ideally to look at the orbits and the lenses is in occipito-posterior position. So what you're going to do to bring your fetal head from an OT position to an OP position is to dip your probe so that you effectively bring the head round through 90 degrees, which can be quite difficult, but we'll talk about that later on in one of the lectures. And then finally what you're going to do is from your ventricular level through to look at your median facial profile, your mid-sagittal section of the face. So what you're going to do here is you're going to slide down and then angle your probe through 90 degrees to come from this plane to that plane to get your medial profile view, and a little bit of rotation depending on how well you rotate through 90 degrees. So that's the sum of the whole thing. And if all those planes are performed properly, you will then be able to exclude the abnormalities or the abnormal appearances. They're not necessarily always abnormalities, as listed here within the different sections. And as I said, you've got that list on your sheet. And those are the things that will be discussed in a little bit more detail with each of the lectures. And these are the abnormalities listed here that you would expect to be able to exclude if the appearances are normal. You're not going to necessarily know what the diagnosis is, but a normal appearance of those planes performed correctly should exclude the most typical appearances of the abnormalities listed here. And the criteria for referral, as I said, those are included. So basically any appearance which is abnormal or not normal in any plane should be referred, or somebody with more experience should have a look at it for you. And you can see here listed the biometry which has been defined as requiring referral here. And again, this will be discussed in detail. So key points to the overview is hopefully working through the 2 overview planes and the 20 planes in the described sequence provides a logical and time efficient, because it's important that you use your time properly with the scans that you're doing, examination of the whole fetus. And examining the fetal anatomy correctly is more important than the order in which it's assessed. So you do have to be a little bit sensible. If something comes up and is in the right position, then look at that then. But you must remember to keep to this mental checklist that you should have, which we would recommend the order that we've given you here. And as I said before, I can't stress enough, your role is to distinguish between the range of normal and abnormal appearances. It's not to make a diagnosis. It's to know very well what's normal and what is abnormal, and whether something doesn't look normal because it's your technique, or whether it looks abnormal because it really is not normal. And that's where your skill and your experiences will come in. And any appearance which you can't confirm as normal should be referred for a more experienced opinion, obviously. Right, thank you. Any questions?
Thank you, Trish, for this clear explanation of how to approach the fetus and get all the planes, which of course will be more extended, talked about in the next lectures. Are there any questions?
No.